how do you think about product carbon footprints underpinning some form of consumer engagement?
I have quite strong opinions in this space in that carbon labeling on products on the whole is a fairly useless exercise. So I kept my strong opinions down a little bit.
You're back on my soapbox, Jess.
I am not a fan of carbon labeling on products. I don't think that it is anywhere near enough to shift the dial the way that we need it to do. It's completely lacking in any kind of context most of the time. It's very, very poorly understood. One of the things that I always say when I'm on my soapbox about this stuff is I point to nutrition labeling. We've had mandatory nutrition labeling for 30 years. And yet, if you look at our health statistics when related to diet and, overweight and obesity and so on, they're all going the wrong way. So 30 years of nutrition labeling has made no difference when it comes to people's health. And it's worse now than it was 30 years ago when it was introduced. So let's not kid ourselves that by putting a carbon label on a product, we are going to magically deliver our carbon reduction goals when it comes to the food industry. It's hugely important from an internal business decision-making to know where your carbon lies in your business, and product carbon footprints are a really great way to do that. How do we then go and start to say, did you know that if you have a Huel meal, that's probably around 77% less carbon than a conventional lunch? But more to the point, because even then, that's still being a bit negative. It's 77% less, and let's make you feel bad about what it is that you normally eat. So what about if we continue to turn that around and say, if you have a Huel meal for lunch, then we can promise you that you're going to get all of this great nutritional benefit.
I'm Saif Hamid. Welcome to the State of Sustainability podcast, a show for professionals transforming corporate sustainability strategies, brought to you by Altruistic. Around 6 years ago, I started walking into the office, I think it was 7 years ago, and I had this weird potion that I would bring and put next to the desk. And I would just sort of be slurping it as I went through my workday. And I missed lunch routinely every day. And people around me would look at me and wonder what this thing was that I was slurping. And I tried to tell them that it was like a meal in a shake. And they were like, is it a protein shake? And I'm like, no, it's not a protein shake. It's an actual meal. Look, it has all the stuff I need in my full-fledged meal. And of course, for anyone following the episode link, that was Huel. It was the early days, I think, in the UK, so 2016, 2017, of Huel hitting the scene. And it was one of these sort of revolutions in just how you think about your workday and working food and nutrition into your workday, at least for me. I'm super excited for us to be talking about Huel in a little more depth today. I'm also really excited that Altruistic actually works with Huel. And so several years later, we're able to be a part of the Huel story. Today, we're going to be zooming in on product carbon footprints and how to use them effectively. I want to welcome Jess to the show. Jess, thank you for joining us. It's really great to have you on board.
Thanks very much for having me. Super excited to have this conversation. I love talking about product carbon footprints.
Fantastic, Jess. Well, we're really going to get into that here. This podcast is, as all our listeners know, this is for sustainability professionals. We try and format this to be as useful and as actionable as possible. And our listeners' feedback is that they love when we go really deep into a topic and give them tips and tricks on how to implement that in their own journey on sustainability. So Jess, Huel's been working with Altruistic for nearly a year now. I think actually it's pretty crazy that it's been that already.
Well, there's a lot of chats in the beginning to make sure that you guys were exactly what we wanted. And then we worked out that you were. And it's been a while now.
Fantastic. Well, super excited that we've made it this far. We wanted to spotlight how you're using data to minimize environmental impact. But first, I want to maybe just bring Huel a little more to life for our listeners. And so for those that know Huel, it'll be for its nutritional products. But I really want to focus on sustainability and maybe just get a sense from you on why is Huel a sustainability native? Like, why is this topic really core to the brand and really core to how you position in the market and how you think about value?
Okay, that's a big question. So first of all, I just want to say I love the fact that you called Huel a potion. I mean, we've been called lots of different things like space food and, meal replacements and protein shakes. I don't think I've ever heard Huel called a potion before, so I'm going to add that to my list. I mean, nutritionally complete food, yes, but potion, that's a new one. Huel is, when it comes to sustainability, because I worked in sustainability and food for a really long time. And then Huel came to me and said, look, we'd really like you to come and join us and see what you can do. And I was suddenly really excited. And I was really excited because it brings together that health and sustainability piece in food, which was something that I'd really been looking for. Because there's lots of foods that themselves are produced well, that the companies that are responsible for them have looked at, how are we doing on agriculture and how much energy do we use in our production and all the rest. But the food itself doesn't necessarily give you a health solution, even though it's produced sustainably. And with Huel, what we had the opportunity to do was to not only give people a health solution, because all of the meals are designed to be nutritionally complete, they're designed to have all the right mix of macro and micronutrients and so on, but that we could do that in such a way that was then going to be, well, not perfect, nobody's perfect from a sustainability point of view, but that was going to also be designed to offer the lowest impact from a sustainability perspective. So that's really what we're trying to do. What we're trying to say is, let's give people the most convenient, easy nutrition, like you having your lunch break, and do it in such a way that it has the lowest possible impact. And that was part of the idea of the brand right from the very beginning. And then they said to me, okay, so this is what we want to do. We want to have the lowest impact food. What do we have to do? How do we have to do that? And that's what we've spent loads of time working on. So I'm super happy to go into all that. But, one of the main commitments that we had, and one of the reasons why we were so desperate to start working with Altruistic, was that we said, okay, we know that food has a huge footprint when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. We know that the food system is responsible for a third. I mean, I still can't quite get over that, a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we're doing so little about it. So what is the ideal meal that would actually allow us to reduce climate change to 1.5 degrees? So what's that footprint, and how can we make sure that every single Huel meal fits underneath a 1.5 degrees designed carbon footprint?
And Jess, if I could just deep dive into that a bit, because what you're describing in terms of understanding the footprint of an individual meal and really even an individual stock keeping unit is already a fair way ahead of what most businesses are starting to think about now, which is scope 3, greenhouse gas inventory as a business, etc. And I think the reason that it makes sense for you to be focusing on this is, as you say, it's really core to the brand and the brand ethos and what the brand stands for. I had a very similar conversation with Shauna at Oatly, which is another brand that identifies itself like from the ground up as a sustainability champion. And what we were going into was, because you're thinking of your market share as defined by replacing a more bad alternative, does that just like make the business case easier? Because internally, when you're saying, hey, we need to go deeper into the data, we need to resource up effectively, we need to really understand every product's footprint. If the challenge, let's say from the finance team or another team comes, like, why are we going so far into this? You're able to say, well, actually, look, this is a really core part of how we're planning to grab market share, is this communication strategy, this brand strategy. Is that true? Like, is it easier, do you think, to make the case internally for sustainability because it's so woven into the brand? Does that make a difference in how you make business cases?
It does. It doesn't mean we can be lazy, though. We definitely have to make the business case. Huel started, and this is not what anybody who's interested in food wants to hear, right? But Huel started as a spreadsheet. It was designed to sort of say, if you were going to have your perfect meal from a nutritional perspective, what does that look like? What is the right balance of fats to proteins to carbohydrates? What are all those micronutrients that you need that so many of us these days don't have? How much fiber do you need? And literally it was a formula on a spreadsheet where they said, okay, this is what it could be. And then these are the different ingredients that would go into delivering that split of macros and micros and so on. And then at that point it was, okay, well, how do we make this taste half decent? And I'm not sure when you first had Huel, but the very first iterations of Huel did not taste half decent. We've
I,
definitely
I
got,
confess, Jess, I think I was early in that journey,
yeah,
which may
earlier
have
than
colored
that.
why I was referring to it as a potion.
The potion, yeah. I mean, it was really bad, right? I mean, it was barely something that you could swallow. And we have got a lot better at that these days. We've got loads of flavors that all taste much better. I need to make sure I sell my product here as well. But when you come from a product from that perspective, it's then much easier to say, okay, we've got that spreadsheet. What does that then look like from the sustainability perspective? So if we overlay that on top of the nutrition, what does that mean? So then how much carbon am I allowed and how much water usage am I allowed, how much land usage, etc. And you can look at the ingredients that you've got and you can look at what their footprints are for each of those different indicators. And then you can start to work out, does it work? Am I going to meet it that way? So I think we were already attuned to that kind of style of thinking in designing our products. So it wasn't a huge leap to put sustainability over the top in that regard. We had a huge advantage from the start because we decided to be plant-based from the very beginning and to only use those plant ingredients, which of course have a lower footprint just naturally. But then we sort of said, all right, but how can we start to really refine it? And we dug down into what's the difference between brown rice flour versus a fava bean flour and so on. And so now we're at that stage of the detail in trying to work out how can we keep lowering the footprints down. So the business case is easier in that regard because we're just used to doing it, but also because we have this obsession with trying to design the perfect meal and to trying to make sure that that's what we can deliver. And sustainability is a really big part of that.
Jess, one of the things that I often talk about on my soapbox is this idea that like corporate footprints and scope 1, 2, 3 is not really very useful. And actually, we've sort of inherited this as a way that, national carbon budgets used to be made and then industry-wide carbon budgets used to be made. But actually, as a lever for business change, I find it, frankly, pretty useless. I know we need it for regulatory purposes and reporting and so on. But actually, I find product footprints are a more intuitive way to look at the actual impact that the business has because you sidestep a lot of double counting. It's much easier for everyone inside the business to understand because in the way that you're articulating, you can talk about like brown rice versus fava versus something else. You can actually put it into context. You can have the same conversation with your suppliers as well, and it sort of makes sense rather than talking about all these somewhat arcane inputs into a scope 3 calculation. Would you agree with that? Or would you actually say that you're finding that both like corporate footprints and product footprints just serve very different purposes and actually they shouldn't be conflated?
So basically you're asking me if you want me to join you on your soapbox.
That is exactly right.
That's where you're going.
Exactly
Okay.
right.
Well, the good news is I quite like your soapbox from where you're coming out. Yeah, I'm not a massive fan of the kind of corporate reporting scope 1 to 3. It has its uses, of course, because sometimes you just need to be able to zoom out and look at things with the whole picture. And I guess also because ultimately we're all kind of running a kind of checks and balances system within our organization. So we might want to use a bit more carbon over there and a bit less carbon over here. And that's easier to do when you're looking at it at the overall corporate level because you can see your space for maneuver. But when it comes to properly understanding where you're going to be able to make the difference and really sort of digging down into those hotspots and what might be driving them, for that, I definitely find the product carbon footprinting to be a more useful tool because you can start to identify things which are happening along different value chains because, of course, depends also on the size of the company, but different products. I mean, Huel's only a medium-sized company, but different products that we produce already have quite different supply chains. So they might have a different version of manufacturing. They might have more transport associated with one product than another. They've definitely got different ingredients. And if you can't see that, if you can't break that down, then it's very hard to know exactly how it is that you're going to proceed. and how potentially could be small differences multiplied up are going to make really big differences overall. So, yeah, they both have a value. I guess I'm maybe 1 foot on and 1 foot off your soapbox in that regard. But I've definitely found the product level to be more informative for what I'm trying to achieve on a day-to-day basis. And if I go to the operations team and I want to talk to them about something, then for that purpose, definitely more useful.
Jess, I'd love to lean into that a little more in terms of the data gathering journey, because I think what you're describing, like, I can tell that you have like just a lived experience that you're reflecting on in terms of setting up this sort of program for success. Could you tell us a bit more about just how you set up to do product carbon footprinting at scale, whether it's like leaning into the data side, leaning into anything around the supply chain? And maybe if you could, bonus points, if you could maybe give some indication to our listeners on how that was different for product carbon footprinting versus corporate footprinting.
Yeah, I'm a bit old school. I'm a veteran with this whole space now. My first product carbon footprint was with Innocent Drinks when I worked there. And we did 2007, it was, with the Carbon Trust. We were one of the first companies to do product carbon footprinting. So my first piece of advice would probably be to take a couple of paracetamol before we get started, because it can be really painful to get started on this process, and the data gathering is just heinous, and that's why organizations such as yours are now existing to help with that process and to try and automate it. So you've kind of got to start with whatever it is you've got, right? I think that's one of the first things that we learn, both at Innocent Drinks and even now at Huel, is, all right, what's a kind of rough guess of what I think the breakdown of my footprint is going to be? I mean, with any food product, for instance, it's going to be heavily based on the ingredients, because so much of that carbon is used up in the agricultural stage. So that would be my first kind of tip, is just start where you think that the majority of emissions are going to lie. And, we started using How Good, who are an ingredient database for carbon emissions from food. And that was fantastic because they had, so many different ingredients in the database. And we were able to really sort of just start to understand on the ingredient level side of things what was going on, and to get that data as sort of close, as accurate as we could get it in that regard. And that's when we sort of discovered brown rice versus fava, this example that's just going to keep coming back throughout this conversation. And then when it came to sort of starting to work further up the value chain, we thought, okay, we think that there are other hotspots in this space, packaging. Again, not too painful because we're all used to packaging tax now. And a lot of that kind of packaging data, we already have. It's already being submitted. And, often cases it's being done by a finance department. And maybe as the sustainability person, you're not even aware that that was happening. And so you need to sort of go and dig into and find these kind of things. And so packaging for us was another hotspot that we wanted to look at. And then freight, obviously is a really big area as well. Again, you sort of think, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare. But if you use any kind of third-party logistics providers for that, they're recording all this information anyway, of course, right? Because that's part of them looking at the efficiency of their operations, regardless of carbon. They want to know how much fuel they're using. They know where all their trucks are going. So data isn't so much of an issue. I mean, when I did it back in 2007, trust me, it was really, really painful. But these days I'm finding that not just driven by carbon, but just driven by sort of the general availability of data, it's not as bad as we thought in trying to sort of pull those different pieces together. I think the most difficult one for us has been around manufacturing, because we use third parties for our manufacturing, and it's very difficult for them to be able to say, down to the individual line, which is running fuel products, this is how much energy you use. But in that case, you sort of have to kind of apply an 80-20 rule, right? Because manufacturing on the whole for our products is a really small part of the footprint. There's no heat involved. It's definitely small. So we sort of go, oh, look, we could sweat the small stuff, but what's the point? Because it's going to be around 5% of the total footprint anyway. We'll take some assumptions in that space. So you really do have to kind of pick the battles that you want to fight, and the ones which are going to be more meaningful to go after. And relax a little bit on the other ones. And it's developing all the time in terms of how you can get that data and what gets moved around. So it is improving. But yes, pick your battle.
And Jess, if you think about, let's say, a few big insights or a few things that you do differently as a result of having dived into the weeds on product level footprints, the brown rice to fava is obviously one great example. Are there a few other learnings kind of coming out of that process that have changed what you do?
In terms of the differences that we've made to our products, yeah, absolutely. We learned a lot around ingredients. One of my favorite things, I talk about this all the time because I was just so stunned, was to learn about some of the inefficiencies in food. So with some of our savory products, we use a tomato powder. And I had no idea, but apparently it takes 1 kilogram of fresh tomatoes to make 50 grams of tomato powder. And you sort of sit there and go, that's ridiculous, right? And maybe you use a teaspoon of that tomato powder in your product. I mean, you just sort of sit there and think, at some point, the food industry went a little bit crazy in order to be producing these kind of products. And there's lots of those.
Just to jump in, I did the same thing as an exercise for roses. So I used to have a rose farm, basically, and a rose essential oil extraction business. And I calculated it took about 80 roses to get 3 milliliters of rose oil. Oh, sorry, it wasn't even 3 milliliters. It was like literally 3 drops, basically, of rose oil to go into a little perfume. And it's just insane when you start to think of what volumes you take to boil something down to a tiny component.
Yeah, just to get that really strong essence or flavor. And just, I mean, I don't know, that's a whole other conversation, right? Is that the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? But there's definitely some really crazy stuff out there with what goes on. So we learned about the crazy stuff, which has been interesting. And it does force you to have that conversation, which is to say, how important is tomato powder in our products? Is that something that we should be using, or is there something else that we can use in that space? So we've had lots of those kind of conversations. It's, there's also been ones where we can sort of wag the tail of the dog, in that we discovered that the data that was available, secondary data for things like flavors, was really poor, and that by working with some of our suppliers and so on, we've been able to, really pull primary sources of data, get much more accurate ideas. And, we've seen our emissions factor for flavorings drop from 57 kilograms per kilogram down to 3.5. And that was not because we've made changes to improve it. That was just because we got better data. So, you need to be able to identify those as well, because otherwise you could spend forever trying to reduce the flavorings in your product, but that's actually not the real footprint. So we've changed some ingredients. We've swapped some out for some other ones. We've decided whether or not to continue using some ingredients because of the crazy, tomato powders and rose oils and so on. We've definitely dug into data a lot more, and we've been using it to pull it into our financial decision making as well, around whether or not to proceed with some projects. So, for example, we were looking at moving a logistics center from one side of the United States to the other side of the United States. And there were obviously going to be efficiencies and cost reductions and so on associated with doing this from just general running cost perspectives. But there was, quite a lot of resource time required to do this, and there would be some upfront costs and so on. But we decided to then factor in, okay, well, what's the carbon gain that we're going to get from doing this? And how can we factor that into that business case about how we do things? And when we did, it pushed it over the edge. It got it through because it was going to save, reduce our emissions by so much that it then meant that the business said, yes, let's go ahead and put the resource and the time behind it to do it.
Jess, can I jump in? Because I think that's a fantastic example. And so if I just restate it for our listeners, right? Like when you actually look at the business case for moving the logistics facility from one location to another, there's a cost profile of doing that and maybe a revenue profile. And then when you add in the carbon savings, that tilts it over the edge. Were those savings quantitative in that you worked out some form of carbon price logic to equate it to cash? Or was it qualitative in that you said there's this additional saving and it's a conceptual saving, but it's not necessarily blended into the cash numbers, if you follow my logic?
Yeah, no, I follow your lead. No, we did it quantitatively. We turned it into a carbon price and then we put it into the business. I mean, it was a no brainer once it got to that perspective. I mean, and that's the beauty of this kind of thing. You see, once you can attach that financial value to it, you can really work out whether or not things make sense. And I've got another example. I think you might like this one. So a lot of our products come in a multi-serve pouch. And one of the things that we really value and our customers really value about our products is that they have a long shelf life. So you don't have to use them up within a week or waste a lot, like your bagged lettuce kind of thing. So our products typically have a 12-month shelf life, which means that from what we understand, the food waste on our products is really, really low, which is great because it's ridiculous to throw out food. And part of the way that we achieve this is by using a pouch that has a mix of plastic and metal in its construction. But that means that the pouch is not recyclable because it's too difficult to separate out the materials. So we've talked for a long time about, should we have a recyclable pouch? And obviously people like to be able to recycle. That's something that makes them feel positive about what they're doing from an environmental perspective and so on. It was a bit of a negative brand thing for us not to be recyclable. But having undertaken the exercise to know what the product carbon footprint was, we realized that the pouch was 0.03% of the total product footprint for a start. And if we made it recyclable, it was going to reduce it by some ridiculously small amount, So in terms of total carbon footprint, it was going to make zero difference. And then we turned, okay, so what's the carbon cost of decarbonization in there? And it was something along the lines of $400 per ton that it was going to cost the business to do that. Whereas if we went down the logistics route and we looked at, changing the freight arrangements, there was no decarbonization because it was actually a negative cost. It was going to be a saving to the business. So that kind of thing I think is really useful because it can be really hard to fight against things like those consumer pressures and pushes to say, oh, well, you have to be recyclable. That's what's most important. Well, not really.
Yeah, Jess, I think we actually come across lots. You were right, by the way. I do love that example. And we've come across a few interesting nuggets like that. I mean, two others that I've come across. One is reusable cups and reusable stuff at restaurants, where actually, if you look at that versus the actual food that the restaurant or food service is selling and making reductions there, it's a massive difference where the weight is on the actual reductions in the food and the optimization in the supply chain. Another example we've looked at recently on this show is methane inhibitors for cows. Very different part of the process, but there's a lot of talk around that, which is, can you feed the cow something that reduces the methane emissions from the cow? And I think the actual price I've gotten from the beef companies is this works out at about $160 per ton. When we did the back of the math, we got to like $500 to $1,000 per ton. Versus if you look at a lot of yield optimization things you could be doing, I reckon you're probably at a small fraction of that when you start actually picking apart where you can get real reductions in yield. So yeah, totally buy your logic. Maybe if we actually start talking a little bit about how you have supply chain conversations, because I imagine that you very quickly get into the territory of having a conversation with your supplier, using some of the data that you're getting from your business to drive that dialogue. The tomato powder example that you shared is a great one. I imagine there's a conversation with the supplier coming out of that. I've spoken actually with a pea protein supplier that I think is also in your value chain. And one of the interesting nuggets that we get from them is that they find two types of brands as their customers. One is usually smaller mission-driven brands that really want to jump into the weeds on what the data looks like. And the other is a lot of larger players that actually just still focus on quality and price. Could you take us into the tent maybe a little on what kind of supplier conversations you're having using this sort of data as a basis?
Yeah, I might disappoint you a little. We're having some supplier conversations, but of course, Huel is not the biggest of companies. So how much we can influence is somewhat limited, getting better, depending on which products we're talking about. But we're definitely having some. And we, of course, again, they're going to focus on ingredients because that's the highest sort of impact area for most of our products. We're starting to talk about different kinds of production methods with our suppliers. So a really interesting one is stevia, which we use as a sweetener. It's very popular because it's not artificial. It's a natural sweetener without calories associated with sugar and so on. But it's not the most efficient ingredient. So we come back to the tomato powder example. So stevia, to get the particular sweetness we're looking for, the sort of just steviol glucosides that you can have from it, only 1% of a stevia leaf can be used to get that. And because the rest of the leaf is used in the process, 99% of the leaf is essentially wasted. Now, I'm massively oversimplifying this, but that's basically what it is. So the emission factor of stevia is really, really high. I mean, it depends, it can vary, but we're talking 500 to 700 kilograms of carbon emissions associated with 1 kilogram of this stevia product. And we took that to our stevia suppliers and we said, first of all, can you please explain it to me, preferably like I'm 6 years old, why this is? I'm not a chemist, but talk me through the process so I can understand why it's so incredibly high. They didn't do that like I was a 6-year-old because I still can't explain it to you like I'm 6. But we did get to the point that they understood our concerns in this space and they started to talk to us about different kinds of alternatives that we could potentially use. And we're actually looking now at using a fermented stevia, which basically, to cut a very long chemistry lesson short, gets you to the same product with a lot less carbon in the process. And it's really exciting. Fermentation in food is really exciting for all sorts of different reasons. And so we were able to have that conversation because of what we've identified in the carbon figures. And now, that's one example, which is, changing that production process. We've got other examples where we're now running trials with farmers who grow oats in Canada and in the UK. And they've said to us, it's really hard to get to the point that we're carbon neutral on our farms. And a big part of the problem is around the use of nitrogen fertilizer. So what we're doing now is we're actually funding a small live field trial with both sets of suppliers where they're now going to plant clover alongside the oat crop. And that's because clover takes nitrogen out of the air and puts it into the soil. And then the oats can take up that nitrogen and use it as part of their growing, and you use less fertilizer. So it's a great result for the farmers because they're going to have lower costs if they can reduce their nitrogen fertilizer, and it improves the carbon efficiency of the crop. And, the more that we go out and talk to our farmers now about, we're really interested in what we can do, not just on carbon, but also on water usage and biodiversity and so on. The more of these great examples we're finding. I found one the other day, I loved it. It was that if you grow chickpeas and flax next to each other, and I might get this the wrong way around, one of them loves water, I think that's the flax, and the chickpeas really don't. So if you grow them together, if there is too much water in any particular season, then the flax seeds will draw it up, and then the chickpea harvest doesn't falter, or it's not reduced, or you don't have as much disease problems and so on. So they are like these perfect buddies for growing together in the field. So yeah, we are talking with suppliers, and we're finding out these kind of things, and we're being able to put a little bit of funding behind testing them out in the fields, or, we're changing our products. So, the kind of insights that we're getting are fantastic in that regard.
Jess, I don't know why you said you thought you'd disappoint me. I love the stevia example. I love the clover example. These are fantastic. I heard a similar story around to your clover one around rice and crayfish, where the crayfish feeds off the husks and therefore reduces the methane emissions. I think the supply chain is full of these. I want to dig a little deeper into the stevia example, just for instance. And so the conversation you had with your supplier there, can you tell us a little bit about how you went about making contact on that? Like, I imagine there's a procurement team on your side and there's a commercial team on the supplier side. And the dialogue that you're describing is actually not those stakeholders necessarily. It's maybe more your team and the R&D team, or your team and the sustainability team on the other side. Like, who are the stakeholders? how do you move from procurement meets commercial to where you're landing on actually re-engineering the product?
We definitely have to start with the procurement team for an introduction, and they will tend to sort of ask their account manager or the supplier to sort of say, okay, well, this is our question. It really helps that we already are known for what we're trying to achieve from a sustainability perspective. Because when you explain it that way, then they sort of go, oh, okay, yes, well, we kind of know what it is that you're about. What I really tend to find is if you can go through that introductions process, if you can say, all right, we're really curious about why this is happening, and our procurement team will make the initial question and who can you put us in touch with? And then, yes, we tend to get put in touch with a technical person or an R&D person and so on. But suppliers like their products. So therefore they like talking about them, and they quite like talking about themselves. I mean, the natural sort of human stuff in this space. So when you don't sort of go in accusingly and say, oh my goodness, this is terrible, you're the worst people in the world, but instead you just sort of say, look, I really kind of want to understand what's happening here, because this is the data that we've got, and there must be a reason and an explanation. And potentially, also for them, a chance to prove that data wrong, because a lot of us are using secondary data. So, they can sort of say, oh, well, actually, our primary data is different in that regard. So on the whole, those conversations are not particularly difficult, as long as you don't go in accusing. If you go in and you sort of say, you're doing it wrong, that's not going to get anywhere. But if you just show an interest to sort of say, please explain this to me, as I said, like I'm six, preferably, then we've had a really good response from them. They've always been up for having this conversation. And the other thing is, these days, everybody's got carbon targets. So they're interested to understand and go through this process. And a lot of the time, they haven't seen that specific data, because maybe they're looking at it from the scope 1 to 3 emissions. We come back to our original chat. And therefore, you don't necessarily see it. Therefore, you might just say, oh, well, I'm looking at it from a processing energy point of view. But what I'm not actually looking at is at it from coming from the bottom up and understanding, is there a different way that I could extract these compounds that we're looking for from a leaf?
Yeah, I think it's difficult if you're having this conversation with the supplier and the supplier says, hey, I'm moving to renewable energy across all my facilities. What more do you want from me? And actually, you're talking at cross purposes here. Do you ever find that almost the inverse of what you're describing happens, which is where a supplier, commercial or R&D team comes to you and says, hey, we have this amazing innovation. We think this will lower the product carbon footprint of your product by X. And if you procure this with us and you kind of have a long-term relationship with us to buy this, we'll develop this and we'll deliver this and we'll help you achieve that goal?
Yes, that definitely does happen. Suppliers do come to us, and non-suppliers come to us all the time with, oh my goodness, we've got the latest answer that we can provide to you. I have to say, on most of these kind of fronts, I'm entirely cynical, because there is no silver bullet. Any solution that we're tending to find, you have to have understood it, and anything that is going to reduce your carbon footprint by 75% is, if it sounds too good to be true, my experience generally, usually it is too good to be true. We've had people come to us and offer us sort of amazing packaging solutions. That's an area where we tend to get it a lot. This will be incredible for you, and it will deliver so much carbon reduction. But usually what that tends to mean is either that the shelf life is going to go down. We might be going from something that was recyclable to something that's not actually recyclable, or it kind of is recyclable, but only with very specific waste management infrastructure, which is not widely available in the markets that we're selling and so on. So there's a lot of those. There's a lot of red herrings in there. And then occasionally someone will come to you with something genuine. So you really do need to know what it is that you're talking about and what kind of questions that you need to ask in order to sort of, sort through that noise.
And Jess, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the pitch, or what they're trying to achieve, is the right thing, because you're also trying to actively do this with some of your suppliers. But the way in which they flesh that out and the way in which they think from your perspective tends to be incomplete, where actually, if they're coming with a packaging innovation and they did the numbers and they find out actually which locations this is going to be recycled in or not, what the characteristics are of that waste system. If they kind of rounded out the analysis, it would land better. Am I on the right track, or actually would you say what is your advice basically to these suppliers to do what they're doing better in making this pitch to you?
My advice would be that yes, sometimes they need to have done the numbers a bit more in that particular regard. That they would need to have properly actually investigated who we were before trying to do a quick sales pitch in that regard. That would help. But in some cases, it's simply that it wouldn't matter how much of that they had done. It just isn't yet at a solution level. And it's tricky, right? Because sometimes you've got this sort of whole chicken and egg, lots of times you've got this whole chicken and egg situation going on, which is perhaps what they've got is actually a really great solution. And it does offer all those benefits that they're talking about, but without, coming back to the packaging example, without a waste management infrastructure that can handle the solution that they're offering, it's not viable. It's not something that we can progress with. And that's really hard. We've looked at this incredible plastic sort of film that was dissolvable. I know there's lots of those, and it was made out of plant-based plastic. So there was no petrochemical content at all in there, but it got really brittle quite quickly. And so, in that case, what they should have understood was Huel is a long shelf life product. We can't have a product that's going, a packaging that's going to break down within 3 months. So that sort of plays to your first sort of suggestion, which is that they needed to have understood us a lot better. But then you've got people who would come to us and say, what you really need is this special QR code on your packaging that will tell everybody how it can be recycled. This is the answer. When it goes through, material recycling facilities and so on, it will make sure that it's perfectly sorted and we have a lot less contamination. But then you've got a situation where and I don't think this was quite right, but only 3 out of goodness knows how many material recycling facilities in the UK are currently using their solution. So that's a real chicken and egg one, because of course, the more of us that bought into doing that and, used it on our products and so on, perhaps that would encourage the waste management industry to use these scanners more and so on. And that would be a good result, but we're sort of stuck in this limbo period in the meantime. And in that case, it's not really Huel that they need to be coming to. They need to be going to, really large movers of plastic packaging out there in the market.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room, Jess, for these sort of network solutions on the assumption that they have some scale to sort of tap in and get volume. The one I'm thinking about is Tony's Open Chain, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that a bit as well. Tony's Chocolate Only is another customer of ours. We're super excited by a lot of the stuff that they're doing in the value chain. And it looks to me like they're managing to now get traction also behind the Open Chain solution as a framework for approaching cocoa sourcing. And I think one of the reasons that has worked well for them is that they had themselves as an anchor customer, and then they kind of piece in other players and are now gathering volume. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you see that initiative and whether you think there's room for a lot more of those, maybe in different parts of the supply chain?
I love Tony's Open Chain. I think it's such a great initiative because in the beginning, obviously it was really important for them as a brand to create a supply chain where their standards were so much higher than what was happening in the rest of the industry and to differentiate in that particular regard. And they did that, and they were able to, make great claims in that regard about what it was that they were doing, and much more importantly, actually make that difference on the ground in West Africa. And then they said, okay, well, if we want to be true to our mission, then we'll open this up and we'll let other people use our supply chain. And then we'll actually be delivering, more benefit on the ground in terms of what's going on. So for us to look at our cocoa sourcing at Huel and to say, we want to make sure that we're doing this as responsibly as possible, it was a no-brainer to go to Tony's Open Chain and say, we would like to be part of your system. We'd like to buy from, the cooperatives that you're working with on the ground there, and to join and to be part of that. And obviously then we need to get more volume into that value chain now, and that's the challenge. I think the only difficulty that you've got there is because it was started by a brand. Even though they've taken off Tony's from when you talk about Open Chain, they just talk about Open Chain. Everyone still calls it, as you have just done, Tony's open chain, and comes back to, if you want to drive real change, you've got to put that volume demand behind it. So we need other really big chocolate companies to come and to buy into that particular standard and to make sure that that is the way that they do things. And of course, if they're a competitor to Tony's, they're not going to adopt something which is called Tony's open chain. That's not in their interests. I mean, I'm not, can you imagine the marketing department conversation in that regard? So I think those kind of initiatives are really good, really valuable. We need to have them. But I think at some point we also need to know when to let them go as a brand and let them live on their own as their own entity going forward, and to sort of let it become common ownership, I guess, in that regard. We had a project that we did a long time ago with Innocent around strawberry growing in Spain, because the strawberry growing region in Spain, it's the biggest growing region in the whole of Europe. It provides a huge amount of Europe's strawberries, right? And it uses masses and masses of water. And it all gets taken from an aquifer, which sits underneath a wetlands, which is UNESCO listed, 6 million migratory birds every year and so on. And it had dropped to 50% of its levels. And we sort of said, okay, what is it that we can do? We were tiny. We were buying less than 1% of all the strawberries from the region. But we ran a project with the farmers out there that would work with us. Long story short, we identified that with using a predictive app and some different species, they could reduce their water usage by 40% across the board, which was a fantastic result. But what we had to do is we had to let that go from being an innocent project. So we invited in lots of other players. We invited in Tesco, we invited in Marks and Spencer's, we invited Danone to all come and own that project. Thankfully, they did. They saw that it was a great thing to do. And now it's actually a project that's owned and funded by the EU. So even though it was Innocent's project, we had to let it go and be part of the greater group. So I think there are challenger brands out there like Tony's that are doing a fantastic thing. And then at some point, we need to let that become public property.
Yeah, I think that especially if you're getting into the space of defining standards, it's very hard for you to have your brand on the standards and expect other brands to also subscribe. Speaking of brands, and we've kind of started with product carbon footprints. We talked a bit about operational level decisions. I love the logistics switch example. We've talked a lot about the supply chain, which I think is fantastic. I want to maybe reflect a little on the consumer communication and narrative side of product carbon footprints and just how you're using this to engage consumers. One of the examples I think you reflected on is just recycling is not just about emissions reduction. Recycling is about consumer engagement and something that makes the consumer feel better about themselves. I think the QR code and kind of how you can actually treat the packaging is another way that brands are actually getting consumers into the tent with them. How do you think about product carbon footprints underpinning some form of consumer engagement or awareness?
So consumer engagement in the space of food is obviously hugely important. If we've got food being responsible for so much of our global greenhouse gas emissions, then there needs to be changes made. And whilst we can do a certain amount in agriculture and we can do a certain amount with food waste, getting people to undertake some level of dietary shift is going to be incredibly important if we want to meet, global targets and try and keep climate change under control. So we do need to communicate with consumers on this. I have quite strong opinions in this space, in that I think that carbon labeling on products on the whole is a fairly useless exercise. So I kept my strong opinions down a little bit.
You're back on my soapbox, Jess. I'm warning you.
I'm back on your soapbox. I am not a fan of carbon labeling on products. I don't think that it is anywhere near enough to shift the dial the way that we need it to do. It's completely lacking in any kind of context most of the time. It's very, very poorly understood. And one of the things that I always say when I'm on my soapbox about this stuff is I point to nutrition labeling. We've had mandatory nutrition labeling for 30 years. And yet, if you look at our health statistics when related to diet and, overweight and obesity and so on, they're all going the wrong way. So 30 years of nutrition labeling has made no difference whatsoever when it comes to people's health. And it's worse now than it was 30 years ago when it was introduced. So let's not kid ourselves that by putting a carbon label on a product, we are going to magically deliver our carbon reduction goals when it comes to the food industry. Having said that, I think that it is important. Obviously, it's hugely important from an internal business decision making to know where your carbon lies in your business, and product carbon footprints are a really great way to do that. And we haven't got this mastered yet either at Huel. You need to find a way to then engage with your consumers about the carbon footprint of food and what it is that, hopefully you can offer in this particular space. So our commitment on a product level is that every meal should fit within a carbon footprint aligned with 1.5 degrees, or limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we know how we measure up. And last year, 85% of all the Huel products sold fit within that 1.5 degree footprint limit. So how do we then go and talk to consumers about that? How do we then go and start to say, did you know that if you have a Huel meal, that's probably around 77% less carbon than a conventional lunch? But more to the point, because even then, that's still being a bit negative. It's 77% less, and let's make you feel bad about what it is that you normally eat. So what about if we continue to turn that around and say, if you have a Huel meal for lunch, then we can promise you that you're going to get all of this great nutritional benefit. So let's sort of appeal to you first on your selfish interests or your personal interests in that particular regard. And you're going to be doing a really great thing in terms of trying to limit climate change. So, trying to talk to people in that sort of what's in it for them, what's in it for the greater good of the world way, I think is so much more powerful than trying to sort of say, here's a carbon footprint on a product. Because when people choose food, they're going to choose it on taste, and they're going to choose it on price, and they're going to choose it on traditions and culture and what they're comfortable with and so on. And those things are all going to be so much more important than what the carbon footprint of the product is. But if you can use your product carbon footprint internally to make sure that you're doing, everything that you can as a company and offer out that meal, and then make them feel really warm and fuzzy about what it is that they're purchasing, then you get brand loyalty, you get customers, repeating their purchase and so on, and you get it more into their sort of day-to-day routine because they understand all of those benefits that come with it.
I'm having two takeaways from this, or I have two takeaways from this. One is that the communication and how you use this data to build a narrative with your consumers should be really based around how you're already building your brand narrative with consumers. It's not slap a number onto the product and hope that it does the work for you. It's actually work this into the existing way in which you're building brand. The second takeaway is that I am seeing this challenger playbook emerging, which I see Oatly and Gusto and also actually Huel using, which is given that the base product is defined by almost by virtue of the alternative, where you say, look, actually, you could be eating a regular meal, but this is better, it's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's better performance, and it's lower carbon footprint. The Oatly narrative is, hey, you could be drinking dairy, but actually this is better, it's more humane, it's more ethical, it's also lower carbon footprint. And with Gusto, it's the same thing versus supermarkets. And actually kind of seeing how the carbon footprint reinforces that narrative, again, just builds on what your business is already developing for itself, which I think is a more sophisticated way to approach the problem. I'm conscious we're approaching time, and so I wanted to sort of wrap up, Jess, and try and attempt a summary of all the fantastic insights you've shared with us. So I'm going to try, and then tell me if you think I've missed something and we should go back and recap. But I think where we started was saying, look, if you're going to be using product carbon footprints as a tool for driving change, let's start with common sense. Let's start with what we already know about the business. Let's start with the data that we already have. Let's be 80-20. Let's put that together and start to identify the hot spots, maybe at an ingredient or an activity level that we want to lean in on. Within each of those, we might identify then a few things that we really want to lean on as levers for change. I love the stevia example, for instance. Where those are going into supply chain interventions, we're going to find ourselves very quickly in an R&D level conversation, but it might start with the existing commercial procurement sort of relationship and then move into R&D. It's helpful if you start to think about carbon in terms of dollars. And I noticed that in multiple references, you sort of implied this very robust thinking around just how you start to set a carbon price within the business. I loved the logistics example that you talked about and how actually it's the carbon cost of option A versus option B that I eventually tilted the business case. As we're talking about supply chain interventions, there will be some things that go beyond the ability of an individual brand to really drive change. I mean, at Innocent, with the strawberries example, you are a really small part of the purchasing. In oats, you're a really small part of the purchasing. In cocoa, you're a really small part of the purchasing. It is helpful to have some network effect in play there that other brands can sign on to. For that to work, you also need an individual brand to remove itself from the branding of the intervention, as we're seeing with Tony's Open Chain. And then we sort of round it out with thinking about how do you actually package all of this great stuff in a narrative that makes sense for consumers and therefore makes sense for the business economically. And I think where we said is actually the more that you build that on top of the foundation stones of your brand and work that into the existing brand narrative, the better. Do you think, Jess, I've summarized the meat of our discussion? Is there anything else you'd add on to that?
I think it's an excellent summary. Well done. I think there's probably two things that I would want to add on to that. One would be to say the beauty of sort of all of this knowledge is that you stop being consumer-led. You're science-led in this process. And then you're going to make much better decisions as opposed to sort of responding and reacting to what the latest trends are in the consumer world in this space. And I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to consumers, but you need to explain to them about what your approach is and why it is that you're doing the different things that you're doing. And if you can explain that based on a really good understanding of your business and a really good understanding of, your carbon footprint and so on, that is so much more powerful. So, don't be consumer-led is absolutely of utmost importance in this space. Know what it is that's going on. And I think the other one is that it doesn't really matter. We've talked about how you're having these discussions internally and how we can use the data internally to influence decisions. We've talked about how you can use it externally to talk with your suppliers and all the rest. And for a very long time, I've sort of thought, what is it that you do? What's your job? And you sort of struggle with, am I a sustainability manager or am I a strategist? And really, what I describe myself as is, well, there's two versions. One is clean, which is to say that I'm a sustainability agitator. I want to just be there and consistently and, constantly agitate for change in this space. And with knowledge behind me, I can do a much better job in terms of what goes on, because it's amazing what you can achieve by just, being that annoying little finger that's poking in the side of everybody, internally and externally. The not so clean version of that I use is that unprofessional pain in the ass. But ultimately, that is what it is that we need to do. And once we've got the information to be able to do that, we can do it so much more effectively. And to, yes, be an agitator, but not in a negative way, but in a kind of, how can we all get out there and make this better? And when you've got that enthusiasm and energy, it's so much more powerful.
I love that, Jess. And that's a fantastic note for us to bring this to an end on. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, it's been a blast having you. I don't know where we ended up on the soapbox. I feel like you had 1 foot on, 1 foot off, and then you put the other foot back on as well. So I think we're ending on the same soapbox, Jess.
It's very comfortable. I like this soapbox. I'll stay.
Thanks a lot, Jess. Well, fantastic. That's a wrap. Thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in as well. We're going to be running a special on product carbon footprinting as a webinar also. So if you enjoyed any of the insights you're hearing here, please feel free to tune into that and we'll go for a deeper dive as well. And yeah, tune in next time. Thanks so much.